But like that's also like an ensemble shouldn't be choosing a piece where one of the players can't play one of the parts. But like
Yeah.
my I think yeah, I do think that here just thinking about like the harmonic language and what you're doing could be interesting. Um,
Yeah, it did sound when I listened to it this time like there were maybe a few too many ideas and maybe not quite enough development of the ideas that were already there.
well, that's something I was going to bring up because one thing I like that you do in this piece is you really explore a lot of different textures and things like that. And this is sort of much more of a texture-based piece than a theme-based piece, so to speak.
Hmm.
There are pieces, of course, theme-based pieces have texture too because they're everything musical has musical texture.
Hmm.
But there are pieces that focus, particularly on musical texture, and pieces that focus more particularly on thematic and motivic material. And so, a piece like Steve Reich's drumming or piano phase would be definitely more of a textural piece.
Hmm.
Whereas Mozart's symphony would be something that relies more on thematic development and motivic development and things like that.
Hmm.
So this is a piece that relies more on sort of textural development. And so I feel like, some of these textures you create are so cool, not necessarily in this piece because it's done, but maybe in another piece, you can limit your pitches, limit your harmonic material, and then just hang out on a texture for a while and try and pace out its development a little more slowly. Um, do you know, like, what are some, I say textural pieces. I hope you know what I mean by that when I ask you, what textural pieces do you know?
I think my answer is not very many, and that maybe was
So, like,
so that may be why I struggled a bit with this because I did have trouble. Uh, I did have trouble writing melody and then kind of going, no, I want more texture, but it was trying to find the balance. So
yeah.
I did struggle with that very much. Yeah.
So, I mean, doing listening and just finding music that's a little more harmonically stagnant, but a little more texturally active could be a really interesting exercise for you just to try and understand like what's going on texturally in a piece of music
Hmm.
and how to develop your own texture. So like, I mean, this is one reason why I really like a lot of minimalist, post-minimalist music because the minimalists really kind of develop musical texture and develop it very gradually when it's done successfully. Um, and there's a lot to be learned from how gradually and organically they develop their music. And initially minimalist composers did this through various process-based compositions, where they sort of set up a musical process. Um, oh, we're just getting a note from Jen. Okay, Jen will not be popping in to say goodbye at the
Hmm.
end of the Zoom, which is totally fine. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Yeah.
um, anyway, so the way in which a lot of these minimalist composers sort of work is they create a musical process or a pattern in which events occur in their music. And then they sort of go through this pattern in a very intentional sort of way, where they
Hmm.
exhaust all possibilities of this pattern. So an example would be a piece like Steve Reich's clapping music. Does everybody know clapping music by Steve
Hmm.
Reich?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, he has this pattern, and then it's played by two people or two groups of people, and then eventually it goes out of phase. Don't make me do anymore, because it's easy to do the first rotation, but then it gets it gets complicated to try doing it by yourself. I do that on the subway sometimes, and people look at me like I'm nuts. Just when I'm bored.
Mm.
Anyway, um, I mean, that would be an example of a very strict process that's followed. And the texture changes as a result of that process every time the pattern is rotated over by an eighth note. But then, that could be a starting point for how a composer develops a texture, follow a process, and see what happens in that process. And then sort of go back and look at it from more of a, I want to say, humanistic point of view, or human point of view, where you think, okay, what parts of this are expressive? What parts of this aren't expressive? What parts of expression do I want to keep from this, and how can I make those more expressive? What parts do I want to keep less expressive? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like in this piece, oh, let's see. The ending, the texture at the ending was really cool, I thought. Where was it? Sort of this sort of texture here. So, what you might ask yourself with all of these repeating chords and stuff is, how could you take that idea and change it? And what could it change into? What could it transform into? So, one thing which could be interesting to try, for instance, and I'm talking about the repeated notes in this texture, not necessarily the guitar melody that you have going on. But I mean, what would happen if you just had that repeating, but you had random chords taken out every time it was repeated, one at a time? So it went from this very sustained sort of pulsating texture to this more sort of sparse pointillistic texture. Like, that would be something I would try initially and see, how does this turn out? What sort of results do I get from doing that? Another thing that you could play around with this texture, you have all of the instruments sort of speeding up at the same time and slowing down at the same time, which is cool. But what if you sort of alternated it, where you had some instruments speeding up while others slowed down, and vice versa with these feathered beams? What if you had these feathered beams occurring at different lengths? So, sometimes the rate of speeding up occurred over a much longer period, and then sometimes in other instruments occurred over a much shorter period. Like, there's ways you can really dig into that sort of texture. Yeah, I'm talking a lot about the when of texture, when events happen, when chords occur, but also the what of texture is important. And so, like, you're having all chords play all the time. What happened if you just started with single notes and then you gradually built up these chords? What happens if you started with a single range and then the range sort of gradually expanded? Or you started with a range with one note down here and one note up here, and then it gradually got filled in. Like, there's many different parameters that you can play with texture. What's the color that you're using, and how is the color developing? These are all sort of things that I think you can ask yourself when you're focusing on musical texture. When do you have all of the instruments at your disposal playing versus one instrument versus two versus three versus four? Like, these are all questions you could be asking yourself. I'm trying to think here.
Well, it's interesting talking, like, this section we're looking at now is how the piece started, almost.
Yeah.
And then the the beginning part where there's just was the second thing that I wrote. And what comes in between was more the idea. I wasn't thinking as sort of logically as you're suggesting, and how to get from, basically how to get from here, which is texture and a bit and some harmonics and single notes, to the sort of full featured, full sound, tooty kind of sound where everybody's in a sense thumping their instruments. That's not the right word, but they're producing quite a lot of timbral sound out of their instruments, and then ending with a sort of bell-like sound, which is. But the middle was what I struggled with, and I think what you're saying is maybe I could throw out the middle and rework the beginning and the ending in kind of the way you're suggesting.
Well, don't throw anything out that you could
No,
say.
but in a sense, rethink how I'm getting from A to B, or interweaving it in a different way. I think you suggested to Brittany, you could. I think you're suggesting to me somewhat that you suggested to her, which was really organically logically take it apart and say what develops into what.
Yeah, I mean, so my whole, I guess, compositional philosophy and teaching philosophy is sort of finding the extent to which a student thinks very instinctually about what they do musically, and then the extent to which they think more logically about what they do. And it's really just a matter of reaching your highest potential in both of these areas. So like right now, I think that you compose very instinctually, which is a good thing, because that's actually, that's in many ways the tougher part. If you're born with that, where you can think very sort of instinctually about the music, and it sort of comes to you, which is great. But I think one thing that you could be doing more of is thinking logically about what you're doing on a technical level, and just sort of assessing it almost as if you're your own teacher, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense because Rodney tells me the same thing, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm listening.
Well, it's not fun necessarily. But, the nice thing about it is it can be very quantifiable, which also doesn't sound that fun. But I mean, think about those days when you sit down to compose and you've got nothing, and it's frustrating because you have to have something, but you've got nothing. That can be very frustrating. Whereas if you have a little something and you can sort of create a quantifiable list of tasks of things to try with it, on a very technical level, then you feel as though you're doing something, and you are doing something. You're figuring out what could work and what might not work, right? So it's about being proactive as well, because yeah, like when I was sort of starting out with my compositional studies and starting out with my professional career as a composer, there were definitely moments when I had to create music and I had nothing. I had no inspiration. I was burnt out or something. And what I sort of relied on in those moments was technique. And it's like, okay, I don't have any ideas right now. Let me try these exercises, which are like not as fun as coming up with ideas creatively. But that's sort of experimentation. Bless you, Brittany, I think. Just like we're in the same room. um, that sort of experimentation, though, can kind of, not experimentation, but that very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Process way of thinking.
Yeah,
Lead
analytical
to
too.
and then you can go to your more sort of holistic creative process, and then you can go back to the process-based thing and sort of look at it and be like, okay, am I doing everything here that I could be doing? So it's this kind of back and forth between those two processes, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm not satisfied with the piece as it is, even though I rewrote it a couple of times. It hasn't gelled for me, so this is really helpful, to go through it like this again.
There's some really beautiful moments in this piece, and some really beautiful effects and colors, and I can only imagine how beautiful it must sound on the real instruments, and it's a shame that you can't actually hear that. But I think that there's a lot of possibilities here, to develop this into, something else as you're interested in doing. Did you compose this where did you compose this? Were you at a piano? Were you
No, this is one of the case. I'm a bit like I. You were asking Brittany how she composed, and it's a great question. This is one where I've composed almost most of it on in the notation program in Dorico or Sibelius,
okay,
and I don't like composing. I was just the circumstance I was in. I didn't have a piano or anything much. I did have my
right.
guitar. I did have my guitar. I did have my voice, but voice doesn't really enter into this. So it was really imagination and trying sounds out and the way they looked and looking at other scores. This is where Rodney helped a lot because he's a very timbral. He loves timbre and he
Yeah.
loves logical structure. And I think he was always a bit with this piece, as I said, he kind of held back on it a bit, but I think uh, because it was sort of a different process I was engaged with, he would have had me work a lot more like how you're suggesting in the actual compositional part. But anyway, it was about thinking timbrely with a computer and without the instruments. So it was
Mhm.
I was like,
Tablet with a computer can be annoying. I agree.
yeah. So it's like I didn't in I enjoyed the ideas, but the actual writing of them, I'd love to have just been slapping keys on the keyboard. I didn't have that chance. So,
Well, I think though there's some value in the fact that you didn't compose this at the keyboard, and that's that you did focus on texture, and you came up with a lot of textures that were pretty novel and unique and interesting that you probably wouldn't have come up with actually on the piano because you couldn't use your skill as an improviser, or your process as an improviser in creating this piece. You had to rely on thinking about it like this almost. So
mhm.
I think there's actually some value in the fact that you didn't have a piano. Did you not have a piano because of COVID? Was it like,
No, it's because where I was,
okay,
I was not at home. I was in,
right?
my brother-in-law's home,
Mhm.
in three provinces away.
I I got stuck um, in Florida actually for 4 months at the beginning of COVID, which was interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't really have a piano where I was, so I was composing, without a piano, which was very strange and challenging. But it can also be freeing in a way. You can think about music in ways that you wouldn't necessarily be able to think about it when you're at the instrument, because when you're at the instrument, whatever your ability on that instrument is can limit you in terms of what you can actually create on that instrument. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, again, just being able to take a step back and think about it more as a listener and less as a performer can be a very helpful tool. I also think like this idea of writing for timbre at the computer, it's always good to actually start whenever you're doing something timbrely based away from the computer and try and imagine how the timbre kind of unfolds and develops and is approached away from the computer,
Mhm.
because then you can really start to imagine it in your head and imagine all the possibilities, and when possible work with the actual performers. But if you start on the computer, then you're going to be very much informed by what the computer is spitting back out at you, and that can
Yeah.
be until you have worked enough in the field and you really know like certain instruments and what they can do, and what different timbres sound like on those instruments, I wouldn't advise necessarily going right into the computer. A piece like this, though, where you can't really compose it at the piano and you can't really compose it with the computer, this would actually be a perfect kind of piece to start with, in a prose-based way, or in a even in like a graphic sort of way, and just sort of try and you know draw the progression of it graphically. That could also be like, I know I used the stock market analogy before. That could also be though, making it look like a logic file, for instance, like a digital audio workstation where you have each instrument almost like a track, and
Hmm.
you sort of draw what each instrument is doing over the course of time. And that way you can sort of imagine the timbre of each instrument. You can see each instrument on top of each other visually. You can sort of imagine the progression of things like texture and even color and combinations of color, um, and not have that be sort of polluted by what the computer spits out. Um, yeah, and you can like that could have been a good starting place for this. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah, I've never
Uh,
used Logic, so I'll have to learn how to learn that because that appeals to me. But it'd be a new tool.
yeah, it's a pretty it's improved like so much since I was an undergrad and first learned it.
Hmm.
I mean, back then it would just crash every 5 minutes, and it was so annoying to use. Even though it was like kind of the industry standard for a lot of music production and film scoring and stuff. But
Hmm.
now, like Logic Pro 10 is really effective, and it never crashes. And yeah, I definitely recommend using it. And to that end, improvising within Logic, which I think I told Brittany earlier, can be a really effective way as well to approach this kind of composition, especially something like this, where you can sort of improvise something on one instrument and then, on another track, improvise something on another instrument and see how the texture sort of formulates as a texture, and still use your sort of improvisational ability to create that texture.
Hmm.
Can't necessarily improvise the entire texture at once on Logic, but you can definitely do it by building up track by track by track. Um,
Okay.
that can be helpful.
Yeah.
Jennifer,
Yeah, this is such an interesting discussion, and I have a question.
yes.
Um, how how do you recommend that young or developing composers balance their time between pencil and paper and technology? We've kind of talked about the different experience of having like this behind you. Um, can you talk a bit more about that? Because I think that applies to sort of everyone in this seminar today, and it's a very cool discussion point.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think that honestly, it's not really about balancing time so much as it is having all of these different tools at your disposal to create what you need to create. So you could start on one tool, and if that tool is not working for you, go to a different one. If that tool is not working for you, go to a different one. And it's sort of all about being proactive about your time. So as I was mentioning to you, Glenn, about like making a list of tasks when you're sort of hard up for inspiration, and trying those different tasks and
Hmm.
trying those different things and completing them sort of one at a time, checking off boxes. It can be the same thing with what you're using to compose. So maybe you're not coming up with anything at the piano that day, so you go for a walk and sort of maybe have your phone out and are recording voice memos of how you're hearing a piece unfold. Who knows? Maybe you're sitting down at a table with blank paper and you're drawing how a piece could unfold, as you try and hear your way through it. Maybe you're at the computer and you're like trying something very process based, and you are just on Sibelius deleting certain notes and a texture as they're repeated. Like there's lots of different approaches
Hmm.
you can take, and don't limit yourself to one in particular, especially if you're having trouble creating something.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's not necessarily a matter of time spent on each one. Of course, spend enough time on each one that you feel like you're comfortable to use it in a situation. So like, if you always compose at the piano and are a really good pianist, but your Sibelius skills are really weak, try doing more things on Sibelius to improve those skills, so
Right.
that when you're in a situation where you want to use Sibelius, you're not going to be limited by your lack of ability to use it.
Hmm.
Um, that's what I would maybe suggest. Did that answer your question, Jennifer? I don't know if she's here, but yes, it did answer her. Okay. um, So yeah, Glenn, this is a really different and really beautiful piece that you've created. We have about 5 minutes left. Do you have any other questions about it or about anything in general that I've talked about?
Wow. Uh, not specifically. Well, I guess you've encouraged me, I think, with this piece. I really struggle. I struggled with it, and I have a love-hate relationship with it. That's one of the reasons I brought it forward to this, because it was like, in a sense, help. I like a lot of it, and I
Yeah.
don't like some. There's something that's just, it hasn't quite come together as, there it is. And
So I'm pretty brutal sometimes in lessons with some of my private students, and I'll listen to one of their pieces. And whenever I hear a passage that I think doesn't fit in or doesn't like, that I don't like, I have the Sibelius file in front of me and I'll just delete it. And I'll keep doing that until there's only stuff that I feel fits in and
yeah,
stuff that I like.
that
And I mean,
that
when I
sounds
say
like something I heard David Lang in a talk said. He says to his students, uh, "So life is too short to have to be dealing with things you don't like. So what do you like in this piece? Well, I like this. I like this. I don't like this. I don't like. Well, get rid of it. Just like that. Exactly what you
well,
said.
exactly.
Until you're left with what you do like, and then
And he's completely right. I mean, yeah, I'll like on the Sibelius file, obviously it'll be a copy of the Sibelius file on my computer. So like I'm not
yeah,
actually deleting their work if I did
yeah,
something I didn't want. But I mean, more often than not, when I do that, we look at the piece again, we play through it again, and it sounds already like 50% better. Um, because you've gotten rid of all, oh my gosh, we have a new student in the class.
right. Yeah.
You've already, you've gotten rid of all of the things that you don't like. Um, and then you sort of look at the stuff you do like. You're like, okay, how can I keep drawing this out and developing this, right?
Right.
I have a
So,
question.
yes.
This is Olivia. She's 4.5.
Hi,
And
Olivia.
Hi,
she
Olivia.
loves to play piano. Can you say hi? Hello. And what would you tell her is a composer's job? What do composers do?
Composers make magic with sound.
Magic with sound. And do
Oh,
they start with quarter notes and eighth notes sometimes?
they do.
That's it.
Yes.
Cool. We're gonna learn piano. Can you say bye bye? Bye bye.
Bye. Nice to meet
Bye
you,
bye.
Olivia.
Well,
So,
I'd be interested. So, Jared, I'd be interested because I did send you the XML file. I don't know how it looked. If you did that to this, I'd love to see what you X'd out of it
let's
or what
see.
you left.
Well,
That's a really
yeah,
interesting idea.
I think we're a little bit out of time
Yeah.
to do that, unfortunately, because
Yeah. Probably.
I'd have to listen to this again.
Yeah.
But I mean, you should do that because
I should do it. Yeah.
your piece, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And you seem pretty strongly opinionated about things that work for you and things that don't work for you. So if you got rid of the things that don't work, or make a copy of the file just in case, and then on that copy just deleted everything that you didn't feel worked, I think that would be a really helpful thing for you to do. And then see, see if you can make something work with the stuff that's left that you like, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I didn't know David Lang said that, but yeah, it's very good advice that he gives there, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Other questions about this? Any questions from anybody else, just in general? I know that I've been talking a lot, but this is a master class, so if anybody has anything they want to ask. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, this is a beautiful piece, and I think that you should keep developing it and keep working on it and seeing where you can take it to. And hopefully this was helpful for you,
It was
Glenn.
very helpful. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. So why don't we take our break then? We'll reconvene in like 10 minutes at Oh, I don't think I can do it as well as Jennifer, but at 1 p.m. Pacific,
That's it.
3 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Eastern. Did I get that right?
You got it right.
Central time? Okay. I wasn't sure if it was like Manitoba or Central or what we call it, but let's take our break now and I'll see all of you in 10 minutes. Except Brittany, I think you have to go now. Very nice to meet you and very nice to hear your work. You know, I can't wait to see where it goes and where you go with everything. So just great job. Okay. Congratulations. Keep up the good work. Bye. And yeah, I'll see everyone else in 10 minutes. Okay. Bye. Hi, Catherine. Hello, Glenn.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. And hello, Minghui. All right, so we have one more piece left, and that is your piece, Catherine. Now, let me find that file so I can play the recording. So, Catherine, you are not currently studying composition. Have you done any composition studies in the past?
No, actually, my degree was in viola performance, but I've never actually formally studied with anybody. I've just mostly self-taught for the most
Great.
part.
Cool. You know what? Actually, I'm gonna go to the email that was forwarded to me of your music because I know that has the link of the piece. Just getting there. Apologies, I thought I had everything linked up, but I did not. Okay, 1 second. There we go. Okay. Day at the Lost Lagoon. All right. So, Catherine, do you want to tell us about this piece a little bit?
Sure. So it's inspired by the Lost Lagoon, which is a body of water, which is located in Stanley Park, which is our biggest park in Vancouver. And there's also a poem that was actually the body of water was named after.
Okay.
Yeah, so it sort of has the three movements, dawn, day, and dusk. So it's sort of the three movements sort of explore like the different characters of the lagoon at those different times of day. So like the first one, dawn is like quieter, and the second one is quite bright,
Right. Okay.
vibrant, and the third one is just more calm again as well.
Right. And did you use Sibelius, I'm thinking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Sibelius.
Cool. I can tell by the just how it's engraved. I use Sibelius as well. Okay, so why don't I play this? Oh, I need to share the iPad as well. Sorry. Then we'll talk about it. Come on. Oh, don't do this to me now. I'm just gonna share it from my computer screen. That will be better. Sorry about this, Catherine. Okay. Yeah, we'll do this. So, share screen. Okay. So, everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna play this now, and then we'll talk about it. Great. Really, really cool piece for solo violin, and substantial piece. I mean, that's like 3 movements. And how long is that piece total? Like 7 minutes or so?
Yeah, I believe in that performance it was around, yeah, like 8 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, it's really good.
Thank you.
I have a question. Um, how did you compose this? Were you at the
Sure.
viola? Pardon me?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I do play the violin as well. So I composed the 3 movements kind of differently in each case. So the first movement I composed on the violin, um, and I how I did it was I was recording myself on my phone, and I played it through, and then I later transcribed it
Okay.
onto the manuscript paper, like based on the recording that once I was happy with how the
Right.
recording sounded. Um, the second movement kind of just occurred to me, so I just wrote it down, like it was just in my head. So I just wrote it down away from an instrument, and then I later went back and recorded that. And then the third movement was like similar to the first one, where I just played it. I came up with it on the violin, and then recorded on my phone, then transcribed it. And I transcribed it first, sort of without any bar lines, and then I later kind of figured out the rhythms I was
Right.
playing. Like I figured out which time signatures it was actually using.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I composed this piece.
Interesting. So yeah, so really great 3 movements. And actually one
Thank
thing
you.
that I really like about this piece, and which I think you did extremely well and is sort of relevant to what we've been talking about, is how the beginning of the second movement fits into the architecture of the entire piece. So the first movement is basically all the sustained notes in the first movement are harmonics. And the only time you get into the lower range of the instrument is when you have pizzicatos. And so when we finally get into the lower range of the instrument with arco playing at the beginning of the second movement, that's a very fresh sound for all of us to hear. And so it's really effective in that sense. And it sort of speaks to just what we've been talking about all day, with how you sort of hold back on certain elements and then introduce them at a certain moment, and they can be really effective for that reason. So I think that you did that extremely effectively. And I also have to say that rhythmically, this second movement is just extremely well executed, extremely fun, extremely like unpredictable and very exciting, and really cool in a lot of ways. And it reminds me of daytime in Stanley Park when you might hear a busker playing on the fiddle or something.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if you were going for that or not, but
Totally, yeah, totally, like a fiddle effect was what
yeah,
I was going
it's
for.
cool. It
Yeah.
reminds me a lot of sort of Bartok and his sort of fiddle-like music, which is great.
Yeah, totally.
Here's what I'll say though. I wish that you had a similarly unpredictable rhythmic language, or interesting not interesting, that's the wrong word, but a similarly kind of well-shaped rhythmic language in the first and third movements as well. Because I felt like in the second movement, this was so sort of fresh and bright and unpredictable what you were doing, but in a very, very cool way. Whereas, you know, the first movement, I like the contrast between the harmonics and the pizzicato, but I did feel that you started to fall into sort of rhythmic patterns that were a little overly regular. And it sort of surprised me that this didn't have any bar lines, because it kind of sounded like it could actually be written in a time signature. So like, I wonder if there would be a different way to approach this kind of piece, which would create a little more rhythmic variety. I like the fact that you have these triplet pits, for instance, and that's sort of an effective way of doing it. I think what it is for me, though, is you always only have quarter rests between every gesture. It's always a quarter rest. And I think that if you actually explored different lengths of silence between these gestures, that could certainly be something that would help. I also think you could roll the dice a little bit on the note values that you have for these pizzas. It doesn't have to be anything extreme, but let's just say you take all of this material and they're all quarter notes, but you sort of roll the dice or flip a coin, and if it's heads, okay, if it's heads, this is an eighth note, and if it's tails, this is a quarter note. And so like you can do that for each of these notes and just see what you come up with, see if it changes the shape of the rhythm and makes it a little less predictable. Think of, do you know any of Messiaen's music?
Yes.
So like the solo clarinet movement from the Quartet for the End of Time, for instance, like something like that, or even in some of his piano music when he has a single line being played, it's always very unpredictable what he's doing rhythmically. And I mean, he uses South Asian non-retrogradable rhythms for that sort of thing, which, you know, is a very sort of theory heavy approach to doing it. But I mean, you could really, I think, just sort of play around with the material you already have in terms of A, the silence that you have between gestures and the length of that silence, and B, the length of each note in the gesture itself, and see what you come up with. And you might create something that is maybe a little more active potentially than what you're writing right now. Or it may not be as active, or it might be a mix of both. But certainly it could be, I think, a little less just regular in terms of its rhythm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And then, yeah, like doing things like this, tying notes across tuplets or across bar lines. You don't have bar lines here, but just tying notes to create a syncopated effect is something else that could be very helpful for you. So, you know, turning some of these quarter notes into half notes, let's say. I know I used eighth notes and quarter notes as a example, but it could also be like eighth notes and half notes, for instance, or quarter notes and half notes, or quarter notes and dotted quarter notes, and see how that sort of affects your approach, right? Because you don't have bar lines, so you don't need to stick with quarter notes necessarily. You could actually really expand beyond that and be much more plasticine with it. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, and that's sort of what you're saying was sort of like what I was sort of more in line with what I was intending, I guess, but maybe my notation maybe wasn't all like I was intending for it sort of the performer to have like a lot of freedom with it. So what you're saying is actually way more in line with what I envisioned like the final product would be. So, you know, maybe if I changed my notation to reflect that,
I mean,
would be great.
It's sort of like tempo rubato and things like that, freedom, you know, that can definitely be executed by a performer. But I think it can also be very effective when it's sort of more naturally built into the music. So if, for instance, you listen to some of Chopin's piano music, like his Fourth Ballade or some of his nocturnes or things like that, whenever he adds sort of ornamentation to just a melody that he presented without ornamentation, that always sort of invites tempo rubato, because when you see a 10 tuplet, you're not going to execute that like a perfect 10 tuplet. You're going to add some rubato to it. And yet, if you were to execute it as a perfect 10 tuplet, it would still sound as though it has a little bit of rubato to it because it doesn't fit into the rhythmic pocket that he's creating necessarily. So it's sort of finding a balance between yes, relying on the performer to execute it with rubato, but also giving them the musical material that will be more conducive to that. Now, you don't want it to be so much rubato that a rhythmic structure is lost as well, because then, it's, if you spend all this time trying to figure out a rhythmic structure and it doesn't end up being conveyed because they're taking too much freedom with it, then that can be a problem. But yeah, finding a balance between those two things, I think, would be very helpful for you. I'm trying to think, I think Messiaen is actually a composer who does give off the impression of tempo rubato in a lot of his music, slower music, but he doesn't actually write it in. And a lot of Messiaen experts that I've talked to, just who play a lot of Messiaen, say that you shouldn't actually use too much tempo rubato with it. You should really keep it kind of strict to the tempo. And that's an interesting quality of his music, I think. So that's something that you could think about here on this movement. This movement was great, as I said, just rhythmically. It's so exciting and vibrant. And you really do stick to just a couple musical motives and sort of reorder them and reuse them in very fresh ways every single time. So I think that's great. I do wonder how you might approach expanding this into a longer piece if you could. It's perfect the way it is right now. But I feel like you could introduce a motive that contrasts with some of these motives a little bit, which could create maybe a little more push and pull rhythmically as well. So, you have like you could do like false starts and stops and stuff as well and really play into that. You could also have surprises where you have like you know what I mean? Like all these different characters can sort of come out of it. Do you listen to I'm sure you've listened and played a lot of Stravinsky and stuff.
Oh yeah. Like in orchestra, I played The Rite of Spring and
right, yeah. So that's sort of based on a block-like structure where you have this sort of disjunct presentation of all of these different musical fragments that don't really seem that related to each other. And you could explore that even more in this piece to enhance its kind of quirkiness. I also think that you could use color occasionally to enhance that quirkiness. You have the col legno here, which is great. And you have these glissandos, which are awesome. But you could also use harmonics here and sort of have them sort of creep out. You have some left-handed pits, which is great. You could use more pits if you wanted to. And just sort of really create a bunch of different characters here using a lot of different playing techniques. But this is really well done. I honestly don't have much to say about this particular piece.
Thank you.
You know what would be cool at the end here, if you had this last two bars as natural harmonics, because you're going up by an octave here, and then this you could go up by another octave.
Oh yeah.
And it could be just, you haven't hit that range yet in this piece.
Yeah,
so.
no, I haven't. I didn't use the very high range for that piece. No, I didn't.
Which is one of the really effective things about it. But you could even go da, 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 on a really high note.
And the harmonic could sound nice, yeah.
And then, but like sort of sustain it for just a second, just as sort of a surprise because you don't have any of that in this piece. And then end it the way that you do. And then this piece, Dusk, a lot of things of what I have to say in terms of rhythm apply to this one as well as they did to the first movement. I think that like on one hand, it does have this very nice sort of lullaby feel to it, in that you sort of have this consistent rhythm, this consistent gesture. But that having been said, I don't know. Do you know Chopin's Berceuse for solo piano?
I think I've heard that one.
It's sort of a strange piece by Chopin. It's this left-hand pattern that basically stays exactly the same throughout the entire 5-minute long piece. And the right hand is essentially this set of, it's basically like a theme that's basically just repeated and varied a bunch of times. It's not quite a theme and variations. It's almost a passacaglia, but not really even a passacaglia because the bass line doesn't change. But the piano melody rather just keeps getting varied every single time it's played. And what's really effective about that piece is Chopin, you know, in one hand has this extremely consistent gesture, ostinato gesture that's unchanging. And then in the other hand, the right hand, he has this very sort of florid, spinning out piano part that's not all that predictable. And it's finding that balance between those two things that's really amazing about the piece. Here, you definitely have the sort of regular pulse of the lullaby. But I wonder if maybe, I mean, everything's in units of threes and it's always happening on threes, every 3/4 notes, right?
Right.
I wonder if just occasionally you made one of those a whole note and changed up the rhythm of the melody in that, how that might sound. Or you made it a half note and changed up the rhythm in that and how that might sound. Just to give it a little more plasticity in terms of the rhythm that you have here. I think that would be an effective thing to do here. And it doesn't need to be anything sort of dramatic and big, but it could just make it a little less predictable in terms of the rhythmic structure. I actually think like you composed both the first and third movement at the violin, playing it. And I almost wonder if you wouldn't have come to these sort of realizations that I'm saying right now yourself, if you'd sort of taken a step back from it and thought about it more in these terms, like you did the second movement, where you sort of composed on paper and figured it out that way. Do you ever start composing with just the rhythm?
Not well. I kind of sometimes just come up with like sketches or ideas, but sometimes I have trouble like transcribing my ideas like into the actual like that's probably something I need to work on. And it's just like it doesn't sound that like regular and maybe in my head, but then I transcribe it and it's just like sort of like looks more basic, you know. So
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, practicing rhythmic transcription could be a good thing for you to do potentially. But yeah, like in general, I mean, so when you've written fast music before, like the second movement, has it been sort of equally as rhythmically involved and driven? Or is this
well, for some reason the second movement I came up with the rhythm like right away, but yeah, like sometimes I just have I've had issues just like I write it down, but then I really have to figure out like what the rhythm is actually like supposed to be, and sometimes I can't always get it to be on paper what I wanted in my head.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Here's sort of a fun experiment, and this sort of goes along with the whole thing which I've been talking about, which is like being very intentional about what you write and not being so improvisatory. And that could be like taking a fast rhythm, like your second movement, and slowing it down like crazy and hearing what that rhythm would sound like if it was super slow. Because that rhythm is really sort of unpredictable if you hear it slowly. I mean, if I just sort of ta this slowly, ta, 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 ta 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 ta. And so you can start to like hear that there are places where when it's slower, it can be a little interesting. And then you might, when it's slower, adjust it accordingly to make it just a little to make it as interesting as you can. But like that could be an interesting starting place to take a fast rhythm and slow it down and see what might work and what might not work. Yeah, do you listen to a lot of very rhythmic music, or have you played a lot of really rhythmic music? I mean, you played the Rite of Spring, so
yeah, I mean, I guess I've played like the Rite of Spring, and I'm just like, I guess Bartok is also kind of like that.
absolutely.
But,
Do you ever like conduct when you are trying to figure out a rhythm?
yeah, I guess I kind of like tap and try to figure out what the actual, I don't know if it's like conducting, but just like sort of tapping and try to figure it out that way.
That's good. That's good. So yeah, I mean, just looking at your rhythm as just sort of a general thing then, and just saying, asking yourself, is this the best possible way I could be doing this? Or could I be making this more interesting? And listening to and studying, music that's very much sort of defined by rhythm could be another interesting thing. So I mentioned Messiaen as one composer. Ligeti is another. His solo cello suite and viola suite piece. He's written for solo strings before, which is great. But I mean, his piano etudes is something that, everybody should know. It's just such a brilliant piece with regards to how he approaches rhythm. And I think, that could be something that could be worth studying a little bit.
Oh, totally.
Studying that. Thomas Addis is another composer who does some very interesting things with rhythm. Are you familiar with his work at all?
Actually, no, I don't know that composer.
So Thomas Addis is an English composer. I believe he's 50 last year maybe, or this year. And he really sort of became a superstar composer, pianist, conductor in his early 30s when he won the Grawemeyer Award, which is the largest award you can win in composition in the world, for his piece of Sila, which is this sort of 4-movement long symphony with very inventive orchestration, and it's a very cool piece. My greater point here, or what was my point? Addis. So Addis does some very interesting things with rhythm where he uses something called an irrational time signature. And what an irrational time signature is basically a mechanism that allows a composer to have several notes at the speed they would be if they were in a tuplet, but not have a complete tuplet. So let's say you're playing regular 16th notes, and then you want, you want like 5 notes at the speed of a septuplet, but not the full septuplet. Irrational time signatures are a way to notate that.
Oh, cool.
And it's actually a really kind of cool effect. Actually, let me see if I can do this really quickly. In his piano concerto, which was released last year, I think, on record, the 3rd movement he uses, he uses irrational time signatures in the piano part. I'm just going to find this passage quickly, and you can hear a little bit. But actually, we might need to listen to an advertisement because it's Spotify.
Direct TV stream with no annual contract.
I'm going to turn that down until the advertisement is over. And it's kind of an interesting effect that you can use sometimes, which is complex, but can create a very specific, interesting effect. We're right there. So let me just turn the sound back on, and I'll find... gonna find this one passage. Coming up. So like there, you could hear the piano. Did you hear the piano was kind of like a little uneven in terms of the notes
Yes.
with downward scales. It wasn't but it was like those are all created by irrational time signatures where he has one or two notes that are just slightly different speeds than the rest of it, and it creates this very kind of awkward but almost quirky time dimension in the music. If you look at some of his earlier works, you can see this sort of being used in solo piano works, for instance, or in his piano quintet, which is very interesting when you get that. So that's another rhythmic device, which I think could be really cool for you to study. Another one, pardon me?
Yeah, no, I'm just agreeing. Yeah, sounds good.
Another one is metric modulation. And what metric modulation is where a composer very gradually changes speeds by applying a different pulse than the pulse which is currently going on through the use of accents in the original pulse. And eventually the accents that create that second pulse take over as the sort of primary pulse. So Elliott Carter, the American composer, invented metric modulation. And you can hear that in pieces like his 8 pieces for timpani, where he really sort of explores this sort of rhythmic technique. And also in his string quartets. But I actually think the timpani pieces are sort of the clearest example of this, where it's just sort of, it's very rhythmical and very beat driven and whatnot, so you can focus on that. And then Carl Vine, actually, the Australian composer, in his first piano sonata uses some very effective metric modulations and creates this sort of gradual acceleration of this piano part, which is really quite spectacular the way that he does it. So yeah, like studying different composers' works who use rhythm and really sort of trying to get some of those sounds in your ear and in your head, and looking at the scores while you're doing it can be extremely helpful, I think. And then maybe trying to recreate it yourself, maybe not as a player, but maybe like with your voice or something, just trying to taw your way through it and see if you can sort of feel it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's cool. Glenn asked a question about...
Glenn, sorry.
It's okay.
I see. Sorry, I'm ignoring this chat. Here is a bit from Rodney Sharman's Dry Leaves for Orchestra. Is this an example of irrational notation? It's not irrational notation, it's irrational meters or irrational time signatures. But I like that, irrational notation. Maybe I have a couple more things to say about Catherine's piece, but maybe we could look at it at the very end and see if it's irrational notation or not. So Catherine, so all of that about rhythm, I think, is important for you to consider. And then I think that in this third movement, and the first movement actually, and I guess in general, whenever you use double and triple stops, you're kind of always sticking to the open strings in terms of notes that you include in the double and triple stops. And that's great. That's good that you're doing that. But I found that in this third movement, especially, that because you are always relying on those open strings, it got to be a little harmonically stagnant at times, because the only sort of sustained notes that you would have would be those open strings. And thus it created a kind of intervallic relationship between the open string and whatever melodic material that was occurring over top of it. Whereas I think that if you approach the idea of multiple stops with a little more freedom and did it sort of thinking about, what harmony am I creating here? Is this harmony sort of fresh and unique in this context, or familiar, and how familiar is it? And is it too familiar? I think that would enhance this piece even more. And I've got to be honest, from measure 13 to measure 19, I actually think that harmony is extremely effective and well executed and very fresh and unique and with a lot of variety. And that's one of the only moments, I think, where you're not using multiple stops in your writing. So what it shows to me is that you absolutely have a good ear for harmony, and you can hear sort of harmonic variety in terms of what you're doing with the different melodic intervals you're using and the different sort of implications those create. But I think if you could approach your way of thinking when you're using multiple stops, as you do in other parts of this piece as well, and find a little more intervallic variety and stuff, then I think that you would, this piece would be enhanced even more. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and you're a string player as well, so I mean, you could theoretically try this out on your viola fifth lower and see if it falls comfortably enhanced,
definitely.
right?
Yep. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So that's another thought that I had about this. Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, just maybe one small question, I guess. Going back to like the rhythmic thing in the first movement.
Yeah.
Would you say it's just like rhythmic variety, or like a rhythmic like structure? Like, do you think it needs like more of a, like, do you think it am I understanding that just needs more like variety? Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, no, I think like the like overall structure I think is fine. It's good.
Okay.
And the overall, but like, what do you mean by structure? Let's actually, I'm curious.
Because I think I just heard you say like rhythmic structure, and maybe I didn't understand it totally.
Maybe I was just trying to find an like synonym for variety.
Maybe I was just maybe that was it. I was just wondering if I was understanding that was the main thing there was.
No, yeah, and I think variety. I think it's variety in terms of when you have notes here and there and whatnot.
Yeah.
I also think it has to do with the pacing of different musical events, though, and that will actually be changed if you don't only have quarter rests between every musical event, because all of your musical events are kind of happening proportionally the same time away from each other. Like it's always a quarter rest, and so your pacing could have more ebb and flow to it if the silence between different gestures was different lengths.
Right.
So it's those two things. When you have notes, adding more variety to that, and when you have silence, adding more variety to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It won't take much, actually, I don't think. And it'll be fun because you already have all of your notes and stuff. So it's just sort of playing around and rolling dice and flipping coins and seeing what tracks, right? Other questions?
No, not really, no.
Okay. Should we see if Rodney uses irrational time signatures in his
Oh,
music.
actually, sorry, I was just.
Oh, yep.
So it's called irrational time signatures or irrational notation. What is the term?
Irrational time signatures.
Irrational time signatures. Okay, because
Yeah.
I haven't actually heard of that.
Or
before. So
irrational
it's just like
meters.
I don't even. I mean I can ask somebody, or I can look it up how to notate that, because I actually haven't encountered that before.
Oh yeah, there's actually an article online about it by hold on a second. I know it, irrational time signatures. Oh, so there's an Adam Neely video about it, which I have not yet watched. So I could drop that in the chat. Does everybody know who Adam Neely is? He's a YouTuber who talks a lot about topics like music theory and stuff. He's not a card-carrying music theorist, but he definitely has an interesting perspective on a lot of things. He is a composer. He's a jazz pianist, I believe. Yeah, he definitely produces really cool videos. So I don't know if this is any good, but that's him talking about irrational time signatures. And then this one's by Paul Steenhuisen, who I believe is based in Edmonton, I want to say, is a Canadian composer. And I've read this one before, and it's a pretty thorough explanation of how it's notated. So that could be helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And let's look at Rodney's piece and see if it's irrational notation. So I'm gonna stop share for a second. Or irrational time signatures.
Time signature. Sorry, Rodney. That's a huge.
No, this wouldn't be irrational time signatures. So
Okay.
this, yeah. So Rodney, he uses parts of tuplets in this piece.
That's right.
But the time signatures still are determined by denominators of for quarter notes, right?
Okay.
Whereas in irrational time signatures, the denominators would be determined by subdivisions of tuplets. So like, for instance, let's just say I'm doing taka 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 taka. So those are like 16th notes, right? Mm-hmm. So you go taka 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 taka, and then let's say we have quintuplets being done with that. So taka 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 da 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 taka 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 da 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 da. And then let's say we just want three of those quintuplets 16ths instead of all five of them. So you go taka 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 da da taka 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 da da da. Like it's a very. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense when you say it like that. It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like, but some composers can get quite complex about it, like Thomas Addis, where he really will have one note that's a, triplet eighth note, and then a bunch of regular eighth notes, and then one note that's a, I don't know, septuplet 16th, and then a bunch of like, he can get very sort of pedantic about it, which is part of what makes his music very unique and really cool, I think. Anyway, I think we're sort of at the end of this. Does anybody have any final questions or thoughts or things they'd like to ask me, or just in general?
Yeah, Jared, I have a question.
Sure.
It's about, as a composer, sometimes I just think the relationship between composer and performer. So I want to ask, if I definitely as a composer, if I give me music composition to performer, how do I have a conversation with performer like my orchestra composition? Yeah. Another question is just like it's the same as this question. Is how composition analysis. The composer talk to the performer, informs performers. So
okay.
This is my question.
So in terms of communicating with performers, my advice would be communicating as clearly and respectfully with them as possible. Not, I mean, if there are situations where they might do a first reading of your piece and it might not necessarily be what you envisioned for the piece. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, but always first thanking them for their work, and then, you know, saying the good things about their performance, and then saying, you know, and this are the things you could work on. I like, that's always number one in terms of working with performers, I think. And then also, just in terms of how you notate things, explaining the notation in a way that's as clear as possible for the performers, especially if you're using unconventional notation or unconventional techniques. A lot of composers might use graphic notation for various things, and graphic notation can certainly be effective in communicating some things. But if you're writing for an orchestra, not a lot of orchestral players will necessarily have that experience in playing graphic scores to be able to interpret it in that way. Or, I mean, they might have had some experience, but just don't have the time as well to like dig into it that much because they have to learn 3 hours of new music every week. So, you know, I would say try to be as clear as possible when you're communicating with performers, and as efficient as possible. Don't use too many words or too many symbols when you don't need to. And then, what was your second question? How analysis can help benefit a performer?
Yeah, you know, sometimes I just write some piece, but the performer didn't really much more about how can I compose, like my feeling, like my motives. So how can I describe my motives and actually analysis to performer? Yeah.
Well, so this is maybe not a great question for me because I don't really perform that much anymore. You're talking about motive, like your intention, right? So, I mean, sometimes you sort of have to, I mean, you know, writing program notes, for instance, at the beginning of your piece can be a really effective way to give the performers a sense of what you're composing and what the intention was behind what you're composing. And that automatically can really help. In terms of analysis, I would be careful about giving a full-blown analysis of your work to a performer, because sometimes it can actually hinder their ability to express it. Sometimes it can help their ability, though. I've had performers ask me for an analysis of my piece. In fact, the piece that the Ashea Quartet is premiering next week, after the first rehearsal, I said, do you guys have any questions for me? And they were like, can you actually like give us an analysis of this piece and what you sort of were thinking and how it just sort of unfolds? And so I did give them like, you know, a structural analysis of where different things happened. And it wasn't like 1 chord, 5 chord, 1 chord, and it wasn't like pitch class set analysis. But I said, you know, beginning to letter B is this thematic idea, and then B to C transitions into this thematic idea, just to give them an overall sense of what my ideas were. And that seemed to really help their performance. They sounded great in rehearsal today. So yeah, I think those sorts of things can be really helpful. But you know, performers, especially when you start working with professional performers, they're often very busy with a lot of different performances that they have to prepare. And so they might not necessarily want to read an analysis of your composition. They probably just want to dive in and sight read it. And hopefully you've communicated clearly enough your motive and intent in the score with the music alone that you don't need to write too much verbiage to have them understand it. And sometimes I've found that it's not necessarily necessary for them to understand the musical structure entirely. If they can understand the emotional intent behind the music or the extra musical intent behind the music, if that's applicable, then I think that's sort of an effective thing. Does that make sense? Catherine, you're a performer. Does that sort of make sense from a performer's perspective?
Yes, it does. And yeah, actually for this piece, it was the day at the La Lagoon. That was the first time I actually was like on the others, because I've premiered composers' pieces and I've been on that side. And this is my first time like I actually got to, you know, do a sort of workshop the ideas with the performer a little bit, and it's quite different being the from the composer side. But yeah, that advice all sounds very good. You know, just overall, just being like respectful and you know, conveying your ideas diplomatically is the main thing. And
yeah, diplomacy is key.
yeah, and then hopefully you're able to convey, you know, what your intentions are, hopefully, and hopefully that comes across and you can communicate that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, was that helpful, Minghui?
Yeah, it helps me a lot, and because I haven't experienced before, so yeah.
Okay, good. Well, are you in the first year of your master's program?
Yeah, this is my second semester, and I just prepared for my recital at the end of the semester. Yeah.
Oh, great, cool. And who are you studying with at Brandon?
It's Melody McKeever.
Oh, cool, great, great. Are you enjoying Melody's teaching?
Yeah.
Good, great. So sorry, I'm seeing some things in the chat. I swear I'm not ignoring you. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's great to have worked with all of you as well. And I'm glad that it's been helpful. Regarding the piano trio, yeah, so the whole concert / competition is still online. I could actually just send you a link, and you can hear all of the piano trios, including, you know, the awesome pieces by my colleagues. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just dropping this in the chat. My piece is first on the program, and it starts at around 28 minutes in, and then every piece follows pretty much right after that. So you can just sort of listen to all of the pieces, which are all great, I think. And the Graham Summer Trio did such an amazing job playing all of them. And then if you want to, there's like a really long pause while the jury deliberated because it was a competition. And I think that they didn't really like just show the empty stage for that amount of time. They probably cut it off. But